Hello everyone, I'm Trish Lynch from IOHR in London. Thanks for being with us on another episode of our Human Rights TV. Press freedom continues to be under a growing threat from repressive governments around the world, with more and more journalists jailed and killed while trying to do their job and convey the truth. With us today is Stefan Simanowitz, the media manager for Amnesty International, to talk about the Protect Journalist campaign. Amnesty International has signed on to Reporters Without Borders initiative, calling on the United Nations to create a position of a special representative of the UN Secretary General for the safety of journalists. You're very welcome to the show. Thank you for being with us here today.
My pleasure.
Now, you've got to talk about press freedom when it is under attack. Now, the UN has announced that close to 800 journalists have been killed in the past decade. There are currently more than 200 journalists incarcerated worldwide. Now, we know that Amnesty International is doing an amazing job highlighting these atrocities, but can you put us into context for us and tell us exactly what's going on here?
Well, as you say, it's been a bad decade. It's been a very bad year. What's happening in the world at the moment is very disturbing. We have a higher number of journalists jailed this year than before, and the number of journalists killed, 65 in 2017, is very disturbing, particularly because almost half of that number were killed in non-conflict zones. So we're looking at journalists being targeted, being killed, not just in authoritarian repressive regimes or war zones, but also in democracies as well. What is happening globally is part of a wider trend of a crackdown against human rights, against free speech, against a rising tide of the politics of demonization, which is resulting in journalists who should be able to speak out freely being silenced, and in a society which silences journalists is a society at risk. One of the things, when you think about the most dangerous jobs in the world, one thinks normally of a soldier or a policeman or a fireman, but one shouldn't be thinking about journalists, but sadly this has become the case in recent times.
Can you tell me how many organisations have signed up to this and shown their support?
This initiative has been signed up by 130 NGOs and media organisations. It actually was tabled originally by RSF over 2 years ago, and it's gradually gaining support. President Sarkozy of France, Frans Timmermans, the Vice President of the European Commission, have pledged their support, and a lot of countries have as well, from Spain to Uruguay, from Afghanistan even have supported this move, which is important because it will give the United Nations a special rapporteur, a special representative to protect journalists, and he will have the power to hold individual member states to account for abuses against journalists.
So why do you think that the UN hasn't signed up to this? Why are they not showing interest?
Well, I think the UN is a big body. I think it takes a long time for these things to happen. They have passed a number of resolutions on increasing safety for journalists. I think since 2012 there have been 8 resolutions. Most recently on the 20th of November they passed a landmark resolution calling for greater safety for journalists and an end to impunity, particularly for journalists who are women working in dangerous areas. And not just dangerous areas as well, because one of the things I also should say is it's not just in authoritarian regimes that we're seeing a crackdown. It's also in democracies, and whilst in repressive countries the role of the journalist is vital, during difficult times like these it becomes ever more vital and more dangerous.
In your opinion, has Donald Trump made the job of the journalist even more precarious by his rhetoric about the media?
Yes, I think the rhetoric from Donald Trump and from other leaders around the world isn't helpful for journalists. It not only discredits their work, but it also can endanger their lives. And we've seen that in Egypt. We saw that they were talking about some of CNN's output as being fake news. So it creates a new framework where countries feel more enabled, emboldened to crack down on media freedom and jail journalists. So I think the whole atmosphere where Donald Trump is using this fake news and even journalists being arrested. We've had 21 arrests this year, or 2017, for people arrested for fake news, for putting out false stories, allegedly, as well as kind of vague anti-terror laws which are being imposed across the world, which then allow governments to crack down on legitimate journalism.
Are there any neutral zones left in the world? Because when we look at the case of American journalist Austin Tice, he was kidnapped in Syria in 2012. And then we have John Cantley, the former Sunday Times reporter from Britain, who was kidnapped by ISIS 5 years ago. This is a dangerous time to be in the industry, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And there are some areas which are obviously more dangerous. We look at the number of journalists. You said it was the highest number, the 2017, of journalists in jail. And half that number is in 3 countries, so that's in Egypt, in China, and the number 1 jail of journalists is at the moment is Turkey. Since the coup in 2016, there's been a crackdown not just on journalists but on all voices critical of the government, and that has seen a large number of journalists who are now waiting on remand or jailed or facing sometimes absurd charges as well. In a country which did have a very strong tradition of a very vibrant media community.
So tell me what your response is to the UK's proposal to brand and jail journalists for obtaining leaks, so talking about up to 14 years. Now surely this is what any good investigative journalist does.
Absolutely. I mean, it is disturbing. It's a worrying proposal, and it is just a proposal, but it would replace for the Official Secrets Act with a new law which would remove the public interest defence. So that would mean that whistleblowers and those that they leak their information to would potentially be liable for criminal prosecution just for receiving that information, even if it was in the public interest to get that information out. And it's not just the UK. This is part of a broader trend where we are seeing often anti-terror laws being used in a way to strip certain rights and remove human rights from and the rule of law, which is a very disturbing pattern, because a society where journalists aren't able to speak out freely, where there isn't open debate, is a society at risk. And whilst it is important, following the terrible terrorist attacks that we have seen, that everything is done to ensure these things don't happen, there is a proper line to walk, so we do not strip societies of the hard-won freedoms and rights that they've established.
Amnesty International has reported widely on the tightening of Russia's stranglehold over press freedom. Tell us why this is important.
Again, it's not just the Kremlin, it's something that we're seeing across a lot of Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and across the world. But yes, the Foreign Agents Law, which was originally in place to target NGOs and to silence those critical of government, has now been extended recently to include journalists and media organisations. And the impact of that will mean that they will have to disclose where their funding comes from, disclose information about their staff, and restrict freedom in countries where press freedom is of essential value, particularly at this time.
In the past, if you had press marked on a flak jacket or the car of a journalist, it was almost like a protective shield. But now it seems to become more of a target. Do you think that the media organisations may have contributed to the deterioration by the blurring of the lines between citizen journalists and professional media workers?
I don't think this can be blamed on the journalists themselves. I think obviously the media landscape has changed a great deal since I became a journalist, and probably since you were working. Things have changed a great deal in terms of the fact that people are able to report themselves, social media allows people to talk about what's happening in their own countries, and I think this has opened up journalism in a very positive way. What we cannot see, we cannot allow, is for journalists of whatever persuasion to be targeted, to be arrested, to be killed just for doing their jobs, and then for those who are responsible for those abuses to go scot-free, and for impunity to be allowed to continue, which is why there is this need for international governments to speak out, and for the United Nations to be given this power to have a special representative to protect journalists.
We recently had the son of the editor-in-chief of the Cumhuriyet newspaper, which is a Turkish newspaper, for an interview. And he was telling us about the horrific conditions that his father is experiencing in the Turkish prison. Do you have any insight into that?
Well, I do. I mean, Amnesty International currently has its Amnesty Turkey chair is in jail and has been in jail for several months, as was our director, who was recently let out. I was actually there for the latest trial. So yes, the situation in Turkey, particularly for journalists, but not just particularly for journalists, but for everyone, has become very repressive. There's been this crackdown since the coup in 2016, which has seen over 50,000 people arrested, waiting on remand, or prosecuted for charges relating to vague terrorism definitions. So,
and it almost seems that purely by just being a dual national, that you're a target anyway.
That can raise suspicion. I mean, there's lots of people arrested for lots of different reasons. In journalism particularly, we've had more than 160 media outlets that have been shut down, at least 160 journalists jailed since the coup, for ridiculous reasons. One man, Mohammed Altan, and his brother are jailed for sending subliminal messages during a TV show that they were doing, apparently to the coup plotters. Others have been jailed for drawing cartoons. So the type of repression of journalists in Turkey is perhaps one of the worst in the world, and as well as 250,000 having lost their jobs. So yes, Cumhuriyet, one of the oldest newspapers in Turkey, is facing very difficult times with a number of their journalists on trial at the moment.
Now, Amnesty International and other NGOs have encouraged people to get on board with social media and petitions to try and free unjustly imprisoned journalists. Does it work?
It does work. It does work. It's something that has been tried and tested before. We saw it with the Free Al Jazeera staff when they were jailed in Egypt. The international pressure that was surrounded that campaign had an impact. And the same, Amnesty International and other NGOs have launched a Free Turkey Media campaign. That's the hashtag, ahead of World Press Freedom Day in 2017, and got a huge amount of public support for that. And yes, again, for Amnesty, our chair of Amnesty Turkey, Idil Eser, was jailed for over 5 months along with 10 other human rights activists, and partly because of the campaign that we ran and because of the public support we gained for that, she and the other human rights activists were released on bail. Still awaiting the further trial, but the fact that they're out of prison, back with their families, is very important.
So it is important to add your power to that voice, isn't it?
I think so, and I think governments do listen, even the most authoritarian governments, even Orbán and Duterte in the Philippines. I think they notice public pressure and respond to it. So I think it's important for people to get involved, and even if it is just retweeting or tweeting a hashtag, or getting involved a bit more. There's all kinds of ways people can get involved with organisations and support human rights activists who are jailed.
That's great to know that it really does make a difference. Stefan Simanowitz, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for watching IOHR TV. Now don't forget, you can also keep up to date on the very latest news on our website and our social media. Join us again for our next episode, IOHR, putting human rights into focus. Until then, goodbye.